I came in that day raving about your podcast about Gen Alpha. I
Mm-hmm.
was telling her, oh my gosh, you got to listen to this. And then like, we need to get every teacher to listen to it. And I was planning a PD that I had the next week. And I was just bouncing ideas off of her. And I was like, we listened to a TED Talk and we read an article. So we were grinding our thinking that way. But I was like, I'd love to mix it up. And she was like, why don't you have them listen to the podcast about Gen Alpha?
Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech Podcast. My name is Monica Burns, and I am so glad that you're here to join me today. If you want to make the most of education technology, aka EdTech, well, you are in the right place. My goal has always been to help make EdTech easier and give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. Every Tuesday here on the Easy EdTech Podcast, you'll hear stories from my time in the classroom, the work I do now with schools and districts, and my travels to different EdTech events. Get ready for solo episodes where I share some quick tips and stories, and interviews full of practical ideas and stories from new guests each month. If we mention something you'd like to check out, make sure to click the link. You'll find it in the episode description or the summary area where you're listening to this podcast, or you can find every episode and all of the resources we mention by going to classtechtips.com/podcast, or by going to classtechtips.com and just clicking on the Easy EdTech Podcast button at the top of the page. This episode is sponsored by my free weekly planner pages. I've created a downloadable set of planner pages for you that you can start using today. It's a great way to stay organized in the new year or anytime you like. Print them out to write in your daily schedule and tasks, or use the file on your tablet or computer to keep track of your to-do list and set your priorities each day. These planner pages are totally free, and you can find them at classtechtips.com/planner. Today's episode is titled Using Podcasts for Professional Development with Matt Smith, and I'm excited for you to hear this conversation. If you're listening to an episode like this one, I would guess that you like podcasts, that you enjoy this medium enough to at least have pressed play on today's episode. Well, today's guest tagged me in a post on Twitter about using an episode from earlier this year in a professional learning session he was leading for his colleagues. So I reached out to Matt and asked if he would join today and chat more about his experiences using podcasts for professional learning. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Matt. I am so excited to chat with you about using podcasts for professional development. And before we get into all of that, can you share a bit with listeners about your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
Sure. I am the instructional technology specialist for the Durango School District. It's in Southwest Colorado. This is a new position for our district and for me. I was a teacher the past 11 years. I taught humanities in the secondary level, mostly middle school. My day-to-day is very different each day. Like yesterday, I did a professional development with 15 elementary teachers about using ed tech to personalize education. That was a full day. This morning, I had some instructional coaches in, and I was showing them how they can incorporate math into coding using microbes. The last hour of my day, I was with some third graders at one of our elementary schools, helping them put videos together in Canva. The day before that, I was with second graders, and we were putting their published writing into Book Creator. Last week, I was with high school seniors, and we were making stop motion videos. So it really feels like every day has a different feel to it.
Yeah, and just the student-facing part of your role, the educator part, facing part of your role, and that kind of second piece is where I had connected with you on Twitter, about using podcasts for professional development, which is what I wanted to pick your brain about today and hopefully get some ideas to listeners who, if they are listening to this podcast, probably like this type of medium. So let's start with your podcast journey. When did you start interacting with podcasts personally and or, professionally?
So I feel like I was definitely an early adopter of podcasts. I definitely, for a decade now, I've been, got a nice curated list. I am a runner, so they pair well together,
Yeah.
especially like on longer runs. I can listen to multiple podcasts. Music, after a while, to me, gets really stale if you're
Mhm.
running for multiple hours. So podcasts and me were sort of a natural fit in that regard.
Mhm.
Professionally, I would say 3-ish to 4 years ago, I started incorporating podcasts into like listen wise. I would use that with
Mhm.
my students as like a station rotation or choice of how they wanted to learn content. And then we started making podcasts in Anchor
Mhm.
before it went to Spotify. And the kids were like hooked immediately. And like, it just blew me away the first time I did it. Like all this discourse that happened organically and authentically in the classroom. I did teach English. I taught English and social studies, but as an English teacher, I love doing Socratic seminars and fish bowls with kids. But like, as you know, some kids, that is a really scary environment. And so the podcast was such a cool outlet for them to, share all these ideas they had on themes and character motivations or whatever in a much less scary setting because it wasn't in front of all their peers. So once we started doing it, I was like totally hooked.
Yeah, there's just so many ways to think about it as a medium for consumption, for creation. I know, just like you, it's probably been a decade or so for me, right, as a podcast listener. I remember trying to download them on my old like iPod where you had to go through iTunes, and that was like the only option. Then I took a break for a little bit. And when I was moving into the space I live now about 8 years ago, I didn't have Wi-Fi for like the couple days, of the moving trucks there. The Wi-Fi person hasn't come yet. And I just got back into podcasts that way. So I feel like I've been this big, little interruptions early on, but now I'm always a little afraid to share my Spotify stats at the end of the year with how many really and
That's awesome.
important, podcasts that I listen to. So
Totally.
let's talk about the professional development connection. How do you integrate podcasts into PD for teachers?
Okay. So again, like I said, this is my first year in this role. So like giving full 8-hour PD was like a whole new thing for me this year. And I did my sixth one in 2 months yesterday.
Mhm.
And I was, after my first PD, I was telling my supervisor, Lori Rossback, I came in that day raving about your podcast about Gen Alpha. I was
Mhm.
like telling her like, oh my gosh, like you got to listen to this. And then like, we need to get every teacher to listen to it. And I was planning a PD that I had the next week. And I was just bouncing ideas off of her. And I was like, we listened to a TED talk and we read an article. So we were like grinding our thinking that way. But I was like, I'd love to like mix it up. And she's like, why don't you have them listen to the podcast about Gen Alpha?
Mhm.
And I was like, that's an amazing idea. And so she like helped me brainstorm it, had the idea. And then I thought it would go perfectly with what we were doing that day. And yesterday it was the same PD, but a different set of teachers. It was, the PD was all about getting students to be content creators and
Mhm.
how they want an audience larger than their teacher. And so that podcast, your podcast on Gen Alpha, I just thought was like an awesome way for us to ground our thinking. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? And that's how I started integrating podcasts into PD.
Yeah, and I love that story, and that's how I, learned about your work. Was you had taken a picture and I think tagged me on Twitter, which I was like, oh, I love this as an idea, and just something that can really, like you said, like ground everyone around one big topic. The same way we might be used to like reading an article before, a meeting, or taking up quiet, 10 minutes during a professional learning day to read an article and then talk about it. Just this idea of, let's press play on a podcast, right? Put it maybe on
Mm-hmm.
speakerphone in your classroom or earbuds and go walk around for a bit, and just listen in so that we can have, right, that common conversation. And not only does it introduce the medium to, I'm sure you and me feel like everyone listens to podcasts, but right, because we're so into it, right? But not everyone has that, right, as part of their practice of learning or entertainment even. So
You're
introducing
so
a
right.
medium, right, to them. And
Yeah.
you might feel the same way, where if I listen to something, a great podcast, I know who in my life listens to one of those 5 podcasts, right? I'm going to text
Totally.
my sister and say, did you hear that interview with so-and-so? I know that, my father listens to my mother listens to some of the same podcasts I listen to, friends, family, right? Like we reach out to people because we want to say that, did you hear that? Right? Or did you listen yet? Because we know they're going to.
Yeah. And like, and on that vein, it's like so rare. I mean, my wife and I talk about podcasts that we listen to, but like, other than that, I don't have a lot of opportunities other than the texting with my folks or whoever to have like a cool, like Socratic seminar style discussion. So that was really cool for us to all come back and have that experience.
Yeah, no, and it's once you're kind of into it as a medium, right? You get those little tidbits or you jot something down or you find an action item from something. So,
Hmm.
when you think about some of the traditional professional development methods, which are
Hmm.
strong, which work, right? Which have plenty of
Hmm.
benefits, right? But what are some of the benefits of using podcasts for professional learning compared to some of those more traditional PD methods?
So you kind of alluded to this with the photo I sent you. I mean, it's totally
Mhm.
personalized. Like some people listen at 1.5 speed, some people
Yeah.
listen at one. And as you notice in the picture, there was no one in the picture because I said it's here on the computer. If you want to just go, some people grabbed a seat in the hallway and like
Mhm.
put earbuds in, but a lot of people like where we did the professional development in Durango is right next to a river. There's a walking trail, so like they just popped their earbuds in and went for a
Mhm.
walk. And then I don't know, I feel like I don't know how to put this into words, but I feel like listening to a podcast is like a personal experience and
Mhm.
we have like the way we react to it and what we get from it is always slightly different. So it was cool to come back together and see what people pulled from it and like our perspectives on different things. And I don't know. It's like taking this personalized thing and then we came back and had a discussion about it.
And you even mentioned there just some of the different ways to access, right? The same type of experience, right? You might have someone pulling up a podcast on a computer, heading to Spotify, right, or their app store on their phone, putting it on speaker, popping in earbuds, moving around or staying still, and even with the medium I'm like, I sometimes do a 1.2. Like I'm very much in my
Mhm.
like my still one times, piece.
Totally.
I have a friend who I taught with for a long time, and her and I joke around a lot about how she listens to things on like 1.5. And I'm like, I can't imagine listening to a book on 1.5. Even though that's her mode, right? And so,
Totally.
that there might be, I know I put a transcript up for my podcast, and a lot of people do, include a transcript for the podcast. I know people look at it because sometimes I'll get an email that said the transcript link isn't working, so,
Mm,
right. It's
yeah.
interesting to think about all the different ways we can interact and, make meaning of that. So, when you either recommend podcasts to educators or you're selecting something yourself, right, how do you decide what's going to be relevant or impactful for your own professional learning or for the educators who you're making a recommendation to?
So I guess I would so for myself, like as a teacher, I still love this podcast. I love Cult of Pedagogy with Jennifer Gonzalez. That's where I got so many cool moves to use in the classroom. Content wise, when my wife and I moved here from Georgia,
Mhm.
and when I got to Colorado, they were like, "You're going to teach English and social studies," and I'd never taught sixth grade social studies. And I use like BBC in Our Time, stuff
Mhm.
you should know. I would just Google the content I was going to teach, not Google, I would look up the content I was going to teach in my podcast app, find really good podcasts. Some were like lectures by professors. And that's how I got a lot of the content to where I
Mhm.
was. And then I would go off on my own on certain things that I was interested in. And then as an English teacher, I loved using like Smash Boom Best because it's such a
Mhm.
great argument pod to show kids the idea of argument and to like bring it to life more so than an essay. And then book club for kids was something that I really liked sharing with kids as like not only a model for their
Yeah.
podcast, but just
Mhm.
like, hey, when you finish a book, if you can listen to this and I bet you have a lot of things in common with what these kids are saying. As far as my job now, like I'm definitely your podcast. I love the Ed Surge podcast. I like the Ed Tech Throwdown. It's these two guys from Pennsylvania that I saw at ISTE last year. And I really like the Digital Learning podcast with Matt Miller and Holly Clark. And then recommending to teachers, I guess my process has always been like start with Google, look for the best podcasts for educators. And then once you get a list, go into your podcast app and start like looking through the episodes and see if it's connected to your content. Is it relevant to what you do? And also, I like looking at the length of the episodes. Like, I like kind of having a couple that are the longer 45 to an hour and a couple that are the shorter 20 minutes for like maybe one's for a commute to work, one's for a run or a workout. And then I'm really big on PD as well. Like, same with podcasts. I feel like listen to podcasts are going to give you actionable takeaways, like something where you're going to listen to it and you could take it in your classroom and use it with students the next day would be my recommendation to teachers.
Those are such great recommendations. Just the episodes that you gave, right? The strategies for finding them. I think it's sometimes, I forget until I'm going to look for something, right? Like if you're in Spotify or Apple's, app for podcasts, you can do a keyword search just like you would on Google, right? You can put in education choice boards, right? Or whatever it is you're looking for. And you might find an episode, right, that pops up, right, around that particular topic. So I think, that is such a great way to think about all the different ways to find great things. Maybe there's someone that you follow along with, and you just skip around. And, for so many of the education podcasts, they're, more evergreen, right? Like that conversation on Gen Alpha will probably be really relevant to someone starting the school year. It's not about Halloween activities, right? As much as I love seasonal content, right? And I do a lot of seasonal content, there's plenty of podcast conversations and interviews and topics that are very evergreen that can just fill the need right in that moment, right? Really kind of responsive for professional learning. So, for someone who's maybe in a role like yours, and I love how you mentioned your colleague kind of being a thought partner right around professional learning and pushing the podcast piece. If there's someone listening who isn't sure that everyone else will be on board, right? Maybe, they want to convince a school leader that this is something that they should do with their colleagues. Maybe they're looking for, more support internally. Like, how can someone encourage and really support the use of podcasts as a tool for ongoing professional learning?
I think like hitting on some of the benefits we've already talked about, how personalized it is, how there's just such a range, personalized in not only like the style that you're learning, but there's personalized in that there's so much content, right? Where you can find something that meets your needs. And I think that's like the main thing. Like, I love how personalized it is. I think that would be so cool to go into a PD and like, these are your learning targets for today. Try and find a podcast that connects to these and come back and be ready to share out how it did.
I love that. Even just that, like being open to say, like, go look for this, right? Or this is what our goal is, like, and practice even searching and finding, right? In addition to maybe having something handpicked, right? That you're giving off, right? To someone to take a look at. So Matt, this is so useful for someone who probably already likes podcasts because they're listening to this podcast and might want to share it, a bit with their colleagues. So you and I connected on Twitter, but I would love for folks who are listening just to know, where can they best connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work?
So I do have a Twitter account. It is at msmitty34. I have not been super active on Twitter until I got this job. And then I'm going to be at ISTE presenting. And I guess I don't know, our superintendent feels like is going to help me build up stuff by reposting. And I'm trying to be better about posting on Twitter. So I am, when I'm in classrooms with kids and we're doing cool stuff, I'm trying to get videos and talk about what we're doing. So I guess that would be the best place.
Perfect. Well, I will make sure to link out for anyone who's listening today. But Matt, thank you so much for your time, for your strategies, and sharing all of this with listeners.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's make this EdTech easy with a few key points from the episode. Share a podcast that connects to your professional learning goals. Let participants listen in the best way for them, maybe going for a walk. Share recommendations and strategies for searching for great podcasts. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from this episode, including all of the ways to connect with Matt Smith, by heading to classtechtips.com/podcast and finding today's episode number 278. This episode is sponsored by my free weekly planner pages. I've created a downloadable set of planner pages for you that you can start using today. It's a great way to stay organized in the new year or anytime you like. Print them out to write in your daily schedule and tasks, or use the file on your tablet or computer to keep track of your to-do list and set your priorities each day. These planner pages are totally free, and you can find them at classtechtips.com/planner. Thank you for listening to this new episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. I love creating new episodes for you each week, but I could use a bit of help spreading the word about the podcast. Can you leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app? Spotify will let you tap on the stars, and Apple Podcasts will let you tap on the stars and leave a 1 or 2 sentence review. Thank you so much for taking this extra step. It helps other educators find episodes like this one when they're searching for EdTech tips.